Welcome, students, and here we're going to cover figure 18.4 in your textbook, fiscal policy in the worst case scenario, okay? And just like for monetary policy, the worst case scenario is in response to a negative real shock. Okay? All right, so let's set up our first long-run macroeconomic equilibrium here. All right, we got our inflation rate, our real GDP growth rate, okay? And we're going to put 3%, our normal long-run growth rate, out to the right here. And we're going to call it old long-run aggregate supply. Okay, and set it at 3%. Okay. All right, then right here, we're going to put, say, point A, our starting point, that's going to be associated with a 2% inflation rate. Now, at this intersection, we got to make sure that the 2% inflation rate plus the 3% real GDP growth rate is associated with a spending growth rate of 5%. So our aggregate demand curve originally is 5%. All right, let's go ahead and extend that out. Okay, all right, we need one more thing. We need the short run aggregate supply curve. And this is going to be the old short run aggregate supply curve, because when we shift the long run aggregate supply curve, it's going to come with it. All right, so there's our short run aggregate supply curve, and it's associated with an expected inflation rate of, you guessed it, 2%. Okay. All right. So then we have a real shock, negative real shock. So this curve, this long run average supply curve, is going to shift to the left, okay, to a point which will be associated with negative 3% growth here. All right, so this is our new long run average supply curve, and our growth rate is negative 3%, okay? Now, what will happen is that the aggregate demand curve has not shifted, okay? But the short run aggregate supply curve will go with it. Okay, so we're going to move from A to B. And our new short run aggregate supply curve is going to kind of cross through this part here. Okay. All right. So so now we've gone from A to B, and the federal government is deciding what to do here. Now remember, they can't see what you guys are seeing. All they know is, perhaps at this time, is that GDP, its growth rate is falling. Okay. So its response is expansionary fiscal policy. And so what they'll do is they'll increase government spending. And they're going to increase it significantly to about 15% there. Okay, so we're going to go from a 5% to a 15% aggregate demand curve here. So we're going to put it out here. And our new aggregate demand, M plus B equals 15%. Okay. All right, so where's that going to put us here? Well, we're in a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, and we haven't recovered from that negative real shock. All we've done is increase the spending growth by 10 percentage points. Okay, and so it's going to go up this existing short-run aggregate supply curve. Most of the increase in spending is going to be absorbed by a higher inflation rate. Okay, and the example here shows that we did have a modest improvement in growth, but it's still negative. We're still in a recession here. We haven't done much to change the situation. So we've got a lot of inflation there. So now we have even more stagflation, a stagnant economy and high inflation, because when we're at point B, forgot to do that part for you guys. Remember the old 5% spending growth rate, this plus -3 must equal 5, so that's an 8% inflation rate. And of course, you know, this isn't perfectly drawn to scale, but you can see if you're doing the math with a 15% growth rate, then 16 plus -1 would equal 15. We'll have a 16% inflation rate there. Okay, so only a modest improvement in growth and a very large increase in inflation. Now, what is some of the rationale behind this? Okay, so remember what we're doing here is we're increasing government spending. So in the first period, we have a real shock, and we respond to it by increasing government spending growth. Okay. Now, if this was a strong multiplier effect, then we could have a big increase in real GDP growth in the short run. Okay, but the economy is less efficient. So when you have a negative real shock, the economy has become less efficient. So if you think in terms of our old friend, the PPF, our production possibilities frontier, our entire PPF has shifted in, okay? So if you think of the economy being here during a recession, you would actually have a lot of room for the multiplier effect to take place. You could have slack in the economy. You wouldn't have as much crowding out. Here's the problem. The production possibilities frontier has moved in, and there isn't room for the economy to grow because the economy has in fact become less efficient. And so most of this increased spending growth is going to be crowded out and be captured by inflation. Okay, and so you're going to have more inflation, you're going to have more crowding out because you're actually pushing beyond the fundamentals of growth right now. Okay. All right, so this is the worst case scenario. Definitely don't want to use fiscal policy in this scenario. Only thing you may want to do is to try to make sure that if this negative real shock is combined with a negative demand shock later on, we would want to engage in fiscal policy just enough to keep it aligned with wherever the long run aggregate supply curve is at. Okay, and we have to let these things grow. So if you think about a real shock caused by a pandemic, that's why it's so important to get the pandemic right, so that our fiscal and monetary policy tools can be more effective, because we really are finding ourselves in a real shock scenario. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed this graph. I'll see you soon.